Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be playing Commander the Great War. This is part 25, I believe it is, of my Let's Play of this game, and I know it's actually been quite popular throughout the whole series, and I know a lot of people want me to continue returning to this series and finish it up, and I definitely want to as well. So regardless of the outcome, I am going to play the game through to the end. And again, this is part 25 of the series. We're rejoining the game in the summer of 1917, and as you can see here going on right now, there's a lot of heavy fighting going on the Eastern Front versus the Russians right now. The Western Front and the Italian Front, as I feel like I'm just a broken record in that regard, are in serious trouble, as well as the Middle East. But at least in the Eastern Front, things are going okay. So that's where we are right now, and let's go ahead and pick right back up. Now, I know in my last video, or maybe my last two videos, I said that I wanted to go ahead and start talking about the late war from a historical standpoint in some of these videos. So, as you'll see here, the Allies continue to attack throughout France and Italy relatively successfully, and are slowly driving our forces back. So, I'm not going to talk too much about the on-screen events. Suffice to say that the situation in the West is dire, and I'm trying to put pressure in the East to, if not force Russia out of the war, because I'm becoming more and more skeptical that that'll actually happen in the game. It doesn't seem to model the Russian political situation, or I just haven't put enough pressure on the Russians yet. But if not to defeat the Russians outright, then at least destroy them significantly enough that I can shift some of those forces to the west. Because the situation that I'm in, unfortunately, is that our manpower is so low that we can't generate the industrial output to meet our demands in terms of upkeep for our soldiers. And in turn, because the soldiers we do have are eating up all of our upkeep, or all of our industrial production, we don't have any reserves left over in industry to be able to build new troops and raise new troops. And also, the blockade situation is dire enough that we aren't getting any additional resources coming in from overseas. We're getting some, I think probably more than was historically the case, but certainly not enough to continue to operate successfully. And the reason I wanted to go ahead and talk about late war is we've talked a little bit about the war throughout the series. Kind of talked about 1917, sort of the fall of Russia, some of the offensives in the Western Front, just kind of a broad overview, if you will, of the historical situation. As you can see there, we're unable to pay our upkeep in pretty much all of our nations. But the reason I wanted to go ahead and talk about the late war situation is I feel like the current situation in the game very closely mirrors what the situation was in late 1917 and early 1918 during World War I. So I want to go ahead and talk about that a little bit, and kind of hopefully we can see some parallels there as we begin our movements here and continue driving in the Eastern Front. So in 1917, what did the situation look like in late 1917? Well, from the Allied perspective, the Germans were still a very fierce enemy, and one that needed to be contended with. The Russians had just been defeated. So if you're looking at it from an Allied perspective, yes, you've got the United States joining the war, and that's big. But you need to realize, in 1915, I believe it was 1915, the Germans helped the Austrians to destroy Serbia. In 1916, Romania was destroyed. And then in 1917, Russia was destroyed, and Italy was very nearly knocked out of the war. It was a near-run thing. At least that's kind of the perspective of the Allies. The Germans, with the Allies, had launched an offensive using some new stormtrooper tactics against the Italians in 1917, in the offensive of Caporetto, and they had completely broken through the trench lines and nearly destroyed the Italian army, took over 300,000 prisoners. So from the Allied perspective, this is kind of terrifying. The Germans have knocked out Serbia and Romania, they nearly knocked out Italy, and they did knock out the juggernaut of Russia, or at least the perceived juggernaut of Russia. So the Americans are coming into the war at the right time with vast industrial capability and massive manpower. That to the Allies is very exciting, and they are optimistic about their chances. However, at the moment, late 1917, early 1918, they recognize America is not yet ready for a full-scale war. There's going to be this period of time where Germany has now freed up over 1 million soldiers by defeating the Russians in the east. They can now shift over 1 million soldiers from the east to the west and use those soldiers against the Allies. Now, I've often wondered myself, was the series of offensives that the Germans launched in 1918, in the spring offensives, I've often thought, well, that seems like a waste of soldiers. Like, why don't they just take those 1 million men that they just, freed up from the Eastern Front and just kind of throw them in as a grand reserve, if you will, against the Allies? The Americans are going to slowly come online. The Allies are going to launch more offensives, and you got this massive manpower, not so massive, that you can just throw into the front. Hardened veterans, maybe you can rotate troops offline, get morale up a bit. Maybe you even send a couple 100,000 back to the home front and try and get, industrial production back up, morale boost, maybe some people get sent home. But in the grand scheme of things, 1 million men, that's kind of chump change. I mean, think about some of the offensives we talked about before. All of these offensives, the Somme, Verdun, hundreds of thousands of people are dying from every nation in just one of these offensives. 1 million men, yeah, that probably gets you through a campaign season. That gets you through 1918, withstanding the Allied offensives and maintaining your position, if you do nothing. And then in 1919, you're in the same situation. Nothing really much has changed. The other thing, and I think the more important thing, and something that we've really ignored a lot throughout this series, is the home front. It's not something I know a ton about, so it's easy to ignore because I can't claim to be an expert. I'm not an expert in the matter. But in 1918, early 1918, late 1917, things are really starting to get desperate on the German home front. And that's not something that was really fully appreciated, I don't think, by the Allies. 1914, okay, things are fine. Everyone's just going to war. 1915, the war is kind of starting to drag on, but, things still are relatively okay. Nutrition maybe has dropped a bit. Rations have dropped a bit because, again, you're fighting this massive war. But in 1916 and 17, the winter of 1916 leading into 1917, things really started to get desperate. There was this thing which I actually didn't know about that was called the Turnip Winter, which basically represented the fact that because Germany was so invested in this conflict, agriculture production was down substantially. The Germans weren't getting their needs met from imports. They couldn't import the food they needed. And there was a poor harvest or whatnot, a poor agriculture season that had occurred as well. So you have this situation where, you've got a poor crop and the diets of individual citizens are already beginning to shift. They're being forced essentially because because potatoes are more resource intensive than turnips, and because turnips have the added benefit of being a primary feed that's given to livestock. You can kind of feed livestock and humans all with the same crop as opposed to having to make specialized crops. They're starting to feed turnips to individual citizens, which actually turnips are much more difficult on the body to digest. They're not as nutritious. They don't give you the needed vitamins. And as a result, basically the only food that a lot of German citizens were getting in the winter of 16 and 17 were turnips. And that starts to lead to some social unrest back at home. And you have this population that's slowly starting to starve to death. There's massive food shortage. That's one thing, to have rations and whatnot. But something like 60,000 or 70,000 children were estimated to have starved in Germany in the spring, early winter 1917. So you've got that situation back home. Now you've got 1 million soldiers to play with, but the situation at home is desperate. The population's starting to starve, and you're starting to see riots pop up. There are riots that are starting to occur at munitions factories, at industrial factories, basically over the shortage of food and sort of this perception or whatnot. Well, maybe not misperception. I don't know enough to say. But you've got riots popping up, and some people think that certain people are not, being affected much by the actual rations. There was actually a riot in the Navy over rations. Basically, the food that was being given to the soldiers had been cut, so the amount of food that they were getting had been reduced. And there was also this perception, it may have been a very real perception as well, that the officers were still eating fine while the enlisted men were being given basically non-edible food. So the unrest started in the Navy. And again, I wonder, I don't know if it's the case, but I wonder if the Navy got second fiddle when it came to rations, because the military certainly got the priority in terms of food rations at this time. The Germans were choosing to feed their soldiers first, because if they aren't fed adequately, they're not going to be combat effective. And doesn't do you much to have a slightly, again, this would be slightly happier home front from slightly better eating conditions if your soldiers are being overrun at the front because they can't resist because they have no food. So soldiers are getting priority in terms of food. But I wonder about the Navy. By 1917, does that shift? Does the focus shift? Do you say we don't need to feed them as well? They're not doing as much. They're on ships that are just kind of sitting in port most of the time? I wonder. Again, there were some pretty substantial naval operations against the Russians in 16 and early 17. But by late 17, after the Russians are knocked out of the war, the North Sea fleet's kind of stuck. Not North Sea, the High Seas fleet's kind of stuck in port because they can't do much against the British, and the Russians are out of the war, so you're kind of just wasting away if you're not in the submarine force at that point. So again, there's riots in the Navy in 1917. There's riots at home. And again, you now have 1 million men to play with. So I think it's easy to think, again, why don't you just sit back and use that as a grand reserve to try and wear the Allies out. Make them attack you, make them take heavy casualties, maybe even start to give ground. Just slowly fall back. Don't launch those counterattacks. Just slowly fall back. But again, Germany didn't have time. I think that's the realization that I've come to, and it's by no means prophetic. I think it's pretty obvious for anyone who's studied it substantially. Germany didn't have any time. They either had to break the blockade, which they were incapable of doing, especially in 1917 once the U.S. Navy joins. The U.S. Navy, in terms of dreadnoughts, is like the third largest fleet in the world, not too far behind Germany, which was a ways behind Britain. Britain was still churning out new dreadnoughts during the war, unlike the Germans, due to shortages of steel. And the Americans come online with some very fine dreadnoughts of their own and a relatively large fleet. Actually, a very large fleet. So Germany, which was, somewhat substantially outnumbered against the British, their fleet was sizably smaller. It was like a third smaller than the British when the war broke out. Saw that advantage slip a bit as the war went on, as the British continued to churn out dreadnoughts, buy up the Turkish and South American dreadnoughts. And then the American fleet comes in and bam, just like that. No question. There is no chance in hell that the Germans are going to be able to beat the Allies on the high seas. So you have 0% chance, essentially, of breaking the blockade. You might starve Britain out of the war if the submarine, successes continue, but you're going to have no chance to break the blockade as well. Okay, so now you're faced with the prospect of a deteriorating situation at home and a sudden influx, a sudden opportunity with 1 million men that are coming to the west from the east. But you also know that you might only have 5, 6, 7 months until the Americans have trained up enough troops and transported them across the ocean to completely nullify that advantage. America is a nation of tens of millions of people. I don't even know. Maybe they had 100 million people by that point. And all of a sudden, you are faced with the prospect of you've got 1 million men, but the Americans could very well bring 1 million men to the front themselves, or maybe 2 million men to the front, and counter everything that you've gained. So what do you do? Maybe the only answer to that, the only viable answer. You've got two choices. You could negotiate, try and force a negotiated peace. Or not force, but you could try and, open up negotiations and see if you can get a peaceful settlement. Or you try and win the war now. And the route that the Germans decide to take is understandable in these circumstances, I think. The route that they decide to take is, let's go ahead. Let's launch these massive offensives against the West. Let's so cripple them that they're forced to accept peace terms. And we'll go from there. And by the way, you can see that Jerusalem has fallen to the British. Pretty much on schedule. It fell, was it December of 1917 to the British? So we're a little bit early. We're July or something like that. June. And so Germany, again, decides we're going to launch these massive offensives against the Allies, and we're going to force them to accept a peace treaty that we put on them. Okay. And they've got these new tactics, which seem so successful against Italy, that maybe there's a chance for that. I think the only alternative that seems viable to me is maybe, just maybe, it would have been possible for Germany to go into a peace negotiation. And I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if there was any viable chance or if the Allies would have taken it as German weakness. But it seems to me that going into a negotiated peace settlement would have been perhaps an option. Again, the Allies may not have been willing to, especially losing millions and millions of men throughout all this conflict. Now Germany comes to you and says, let's have a peace. You'll be like, yeah, sure, let's have a peace. You give us everything we want because we've lost so much. And then, in all likelihood, the Allies just kind of delay until the Americans are on the field, and then they've got 3 million men, and their situation on the field is improved. So, again, the only appealing option at that point is to launch an attack against the Allies and so degrade their position on the battlefield where they're forced to be at least amenable to a peace treaty. Even if everything doesn't go perfect, maybe you put them in a situation where they're in such a bad situation that they're forced to at least be agreeable. Maybe they think, okay, we still could win, but the cost is just going to be so much more great and take so much more time that it's just, fine, whatever. We'll see what you have to say. We'll accept your peace treaty. But, outside of that still requires a massive military success. So again, we're right back to where we were after 17 minutes of rambling. Well, not 17 minutes because I haven't been talking about it the whole time. But anyway, you get my point. We're right back to where we were, where the decision is really Germany's only viable solution, shy of surrender and maybe getting slightly better conditions because they've got they still have got a functioning military and state, at least at this point. Germany's right back where we were, where they need to seriously look at launching an offensive. Use those million men while you've got them. Use that advantage while you've got them. They have more riflemen in the trenches when those soldiers start arriving, and see what you can accomplish. So that's the situation in 1918, and the Germans begin to prepare for a massive offensive against the Allies on the Western Front, again, to try and win the war as quickly as possible. What I do wonder, given this circumstance, the one thing I wonder is, what if, there's always what ifs in every single historical situation. But what if the Germans had decided, instead of launching unrestricted U-boat warfare, let's not do that. What if the Americans had stayed out of the war? Then in 1917, you have Russia knocked out of the war, and France and Britain are fighting Germany alone. It doesn't change the strategic situation in 1918, early 1918. But it does give the Germans perhaps a more plausible route to a negotiated peace. The situation on the home front is so desperate. We realistically know that, even 1 million men, it's hard to say that for sure it'll turn the tide and win the war. So maybe we just go for a negotiated peace. Or maybe the offensives that occur in 1918, as successful as they are initially, and then they turn around after the conclusion and say, listen, we can do this to you again, but why don't we negotiate? Why don't we come to some kind of sensible agreement at a peace treaty? Because by that point, the Germans probably got all they really need in terms of like dramatic, earth-changing, successful diplomatic, coups with the peace treaty with the Russians. They got so much control and influence over Eastern Europe. They could make the argument that they got everything they wanted out of the war and accept a more palatable peace with the Western Allies. Or maybe the public, after those massive setbacks in 1918, says they have to. I don't know. It's interesting to think. I also wonder if the Allied offensives against the Germans would have been quite as successful in 1918 if they hadn't had the American manpower reserves to draw upon. But anyway, as you can see, after 20 minutes of discussion, the situation in 1918 is desperate for the Germans, and they are really in a unique situation where they've got 1 million men that are coming back to the West, but they've only got a limited period of time where those are going to be dramatically successful. The situation on the home front doesn't allow them to take the long view. The situation on the battlefield presents a fleeting short-term advantage. So, the decision is made quite logically to attack. And that's what they do. And that's where you see the 5, 6, 7 German drives against the Allies in 1918, and the famous Operation Michael, which breaks through the trench line. And the Germans see successes that they haven't seen in 4 years of trench warfare. But that discussion is actually going to be for another time. That'll be for the next video. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about Operation Michael in the next video. In this video, as you can see, throughout this entire time that I've been talking, the Western Allies, the French and the British, are cracking through our lines, just absolutely shattering our troops, pushing us to the very brink. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, we've pocketed quite a few Russian troops. The situation is okay there. We've got a little bit in the way of industrial production that I can use to try and, get some reinforcements. The Italian front is desperate. There's an open road straight to Vienna if the Allies want to take it. Although at least as Austria, I do have some spare industrial capacity that I can purchase 2 infantry units that I should be able to help stem the tide a bit. So there's that positive. Meanwhile, I've moved the troops up in southern Italy that were cut off. They aren't totally out of supply because, again, the way the supply rules work, capital cities generate their own supply. So my troops in southern Italy still have supply. Move those Germans north from Florence, if only in the effort to draw the Allies away until those troops are raised so I can get some reinforcements into Vienna. And the situation in the Middle East is desperate. Jerusalem's fallen. Damascus will probably be overrun in the next day or two. And I'm really going to need to start shifting forces there as well to try and stem the tide in the Middle East. But again, everything in Russia is positive, and hopefully we can turn things around enough that that we can still gather a victory, or at least maybe a draw. Anyway, we're about 23.5 minutes into this video, and really this video was about setting up the situation in 1918 as the Germans launched their sort of last-ditch effort attacks against the Allies. I think I'll cut the video off a little bit shorter than normal, but what we're going to talk about in our next video, if we survive, because you can see the Allies here on the Western Front are still hitting us hard, is we'll talk about the actual offensives of 1918. And I hate to break it to you folks, but it certainly seems, I don't know because I haven't played too far in advance, but it certainly seems and feels like we're living on borrowed time, so this series may not have too much longer with the way the Allies are pushing us back and shattering our forces. Unless things dramatically change, I'm not too optimistic about our chances. But again, that's a discussion for another time. If we can beat the Russians, it'll free up a whole bunch of troops we can shift west. But again, the problem is we don't have the industrial capacity to reinforce them. So we'll see what happens there. Anyway, guys, With the Western allies pressing us hard and threatening to overrun our front line and roll everything up, we've actually almost been totally kicked out of Belgium, as you can see here. We've got a little bit of territory left in Belgium, and the allies just took Stuttgart. Losing those 3 industrial points isn't going to help matters at all in terms of production. But yeah. Meanwhile, the French have now invaded into Austria proper, and Damascus is under assault here by the British. And you can see they're... I don't even know. Nope, doesn't even matter. They just conquered Damascus. All of our troops are basically destroyed. They've now got a straight rail line to the Arabian rebels as well. So, yeah. Things are looking down right now. Anyway, guys, as I said a few minutes ago, I appreciate you tuning in. We're going to go ahead and cut the video off here. It does look like the AI phase is just going to end. There it is. And Metz also has fallen. So, again, you can see the military situation is, yeah, things are bad. But anyway, guys, until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.